to make sure that we have this recording for you all. Okay, that's all set. I'm your host, Carrie Kennengeiser. I'm the program coordinator for South Carolina Partnerships for Inclusion, and we are so glad to have been able to offer this training for you all by Dr. Jennifer Grisham. So before we get started this morning, we have a couple housekeeping items to ensure the best virtual learning experience for all. So again, this session is being recorded and will be sent out to all registrants next week. We will also house all 3 of these sessions on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. All of your attendee video and microphones have been muted, so you don't have to worry about that. A copy of these session slides along with a sample intervention plan was emailed to you earlier this week, so you'll have that to use during the session. If you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to put them in the chat box. We'll do our best to answer the questions today. If for any reason we're unable to answer them today, we'll make sure to get back to you as soon as possible. And we will share a link to complete a brief evaluation about today's training in the chat box at the end of this session. And as a last reminder, if you signed up to receive childcare training credits or CEUs, you must view this live session in its entirety today. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us at Skippy, which is scpi@mailbox.sc.edu. I will go ahead and pass it over to Dr. Grisham.
Thank you, Carrie. It's very nice to be with you all today, and I want to thank those of you who have hung in there with us throughout the entire 3 parts of this series. I hope today that we will finish things up, but that the work that we've started will continue afterward, because our hope was that some of the strategies that I've taught you are interventions and instructional strategies that you can use here moving forward. So our objectives for today, our original intent was that by separating the second session from this one by a few weeks, that there might be an opportunity for you all to actually implement your intervention plan. And with a group this size, it's a little bit more difficult to do sharing and that sort of thing, but I do want to offer you an opportunity to provide feedback and any type of challenges that you came across as you were trying to implement. I know there haven't been that many weeks since the holiday break, so it may have been difficult for you to do that. So we thought that what we would do today is to start by reviewing the intervention plan development process, just so we make sure that you understand the steps for doing this. The second thing that we're going to be discussing today is implementation, evaluation, and fidelity of the implementation of the intervention plans. And so it's one thing to develop a plan, it's another thing to do it and do it correctly. And so we're going to spend some time later on looking at a sample intervention plan and then looking at a videotape of a teacher who is implementing that intervention plan and have a discussion about the extent to which she is implementing the intervention correctly. And why is that even important? And I'll share a little tiny bit of research about why that's important. So let's begin by first of all, reminding you what an intervention plan is. Another way of thinking about it is that it's kind of like a recipe. And I often equate it to that because when we learn how to do certain things, we very closely follow the steps of how to do that new thing that we've been doing. Right now, I'm in physical therapy, and I have all of these different exercises I'm supposed to do. And for the first few weeks after I get my new list, she has a picture. She also has the words written on there, so it's a very close recipe for what I'm supposed to do. And I'll follow that recipe very closely and watch it and look at it and refer back to it very closely. And then when I start feeling pretty good about it, I'll start doing the exercises on my own. And The problem is that sometimes something just won't feel right when I'm in the middle of doing one of the exercises, and I realize that I likely have not been following the plan closely enough. And so, an intervention plan is kind of like those recipes or those step by step instructions that we get for other aspects of our life. And this becomes especially important in terms of adherence and following it closely when we're talking about children who have significant disabilities and deaf blindness, like the group of children that we've been discussing in this training series. Because their response modes are very different than typically developing children, because their processing time is very different, because the way that they receive information is very different and very unique to them. It's super important for us then to respond in the way that we have decided that we're going to respond, to allow the right amount of wait time that we're supposed to wait, um, to to be able to differentiate between what is a correct and an incorrect response so that we can be consistent in our responses. And so the intervention plan plays a huge role in implementing um, evidence-based practices for children with significant disabilities and deaf blindness with integrity, with fidelity. So you might want to remember that we had a discussion about embedded learning opportunities. And a way to think about an embedded learning opportunities is that it is an ARC, which stands for antecedent, response, and consequences. So it's essentially what we do at the beginning to set the occasion for the child to respond. It's a description of what those incorrect and correct responses are, and it's what we do as adults after the child responds. If the child responds correctly, we do one thing. If the child responds incorrectly, we do another. And so the intervention plan is that recipe for how to follow an ARC, which is simply another word for an embedded learning opportunity. So we want it to be followed consistently to ensure that the child learns the target skill. And the most important thing is that it needs to change if the child is not making progress. So I've spoken with you all about some of the coaching that we do with families of children with deaf blindness here in Kentucky. And one of the things that we do at each of our coaching sessions is to review that intervention plan to make sure that all parts of it are being done correctly. For example, I showed you all a videotape uh, of our little friend Peter a few weeks ago. And one of the activities that we identified to serve as a context for teaching him how to sign that he wanted more of something was listening to music and dancing to music. And after our first coaching session, his mother said to us that, you know what, music really doesn't turn him on that much. He likes it okay, but he doesn't like it enough that it's motivating enough for him to want to communicate and say that he wants more of something. And so we changed that activity. And those are the kinds of discussions that need to be had, hopefully amongst a team of people. But I understand the dynamics of how difficult it is for a team to have regular meetings. But certainly, the person who's the primary implementer or whoever is doing the coaching with the primary implementer needs to review that intervention plan carefully to make sure that it is still working for the child so that we're getting the best result. As I think I've probably said in this workshop, I know I say it almost every time I teach, it's not children that fail, it's our planning that fails. It's us, our teaching that fails. And so if a child is not making progress, it's not because they're doing something wrong, it's because we need to change something and do something different in terms of our intervention. So remember 3 parts to the intervention plan. The first part is the antecedent, and that includes a consideration about when we teach. So what parts of the day do we teach? What things do we need to take into consideration when we're determining when to teach? You know, when is the child most alert? When are the activities occurring that are most motivating to the child? Those are the things that we need to consider. We also need to think about where we're going to teach, what location. So we have to think about, what are the activities, and then we have to think about where do they occur. And so if a child, for example, really loves to swing, then that's probably going to occur on the playground. If there's if the child really likes the people that are in the cafeteria at the school, then maybe the intervention occurs in the cafeteria during the mealtime. And so we need to, again, always take into account what is motivating, what that child really likes to do when we are determining where and when we're going to teach. And the same goes true, of course, with what we teach with. And not only do we need to take motivation into account, but we also need to take into account the sensory and physical needs of the child. And so, for some children who have deaf blindness, for example, the children really like things that vibrate. Um, Sometimes, if they have enough residual hearing, they may also like music and the beat to certain tones of music. They might also like things that have certain movement properties to them, or things that have reflective properties to them. Like I, I went to a workshop, did a parent workshop a while back, and every one of the presenters had on a big puffy, um, like mylar kind of name tag, so that the children, many children, especially children, a lot of children who have cortical visual impairment, they really are attracted to and really see those types of objects that have that reflective property that kind of move back and forth. And so, um, children, we're talking about in this course, we've been talking about how to improve the social, emotional, and the communication needs of this population. And so it's really important to take into account those things that are going to be preferences for the child when we're building a program for them, because those are the things that they're going to want to interact with others most likely with. And they're also going to be the things that the child is going to want to communicate about. And so, just like with my little friend Peter, if I like music, okay, but I don't like it enough that I want to engage in an activity with you with it, or I don't really want to tell you that I want to continue that activity, then it's best to choose something else. Um, so what we teach with is important. And then the crux of this is how to set the occasion. And I want to point out again that there are 4 parts to this. When I've done face-to-face workshops and I've had the opportunity to provide feedback to folks on their intervention plans, oftentimes people forget that, that there are 4 distinct elements to this, how to set the occasion. So we have to, first of all, get the child's attention. We have to make sure that the child is with us, if you will. Some of the children we work with, because of their complex needs, oftentimes have altered or lowered states of awareness. And so if they're sleepy, if they're not alert, awake is the term that we generally use, and they're not paying attention to what it is we're talking about or we're engaging with, then the child is not going to be able to learn. And so we have to make sure we have the child's attention first. We need to give them an opportunity to know what it is, what activity we're doing. So that's what it means by establishing the topic. So it's time to listen to music, or, it's time for snack or whatever, just so that the child is aware. This is something that we talk a great deal about when working with children who are deafblind, because those children don't have access to a lot of the incidental and environmental information that people who have intact vision and hearing have, where they can just look at the environment and understand, oh, well, everybody is getting their lunch boxes out, and they're cleaning the tables, and everybody's washing their hands. And they sometimes don't use that incidental information that the rest of us do, because of their impaired sensory systems, to be able to put that together to say, oh, it's a mealtime. So instead, whoever is interacting directly with that child has to be someone who is giving that information to them so that they know what is about to happen. And then we have to figure out a way to make a request in a format that the child can understand. And so we have to take into account, this is the receptive language piece of this. So how does the child receive information? How does the child, how do we give direction to the child if that's what it is that we're trying to do? And so this can be a combination of a variety of different methods or ways that a child might do this. We might use tactile symbols, we might use sign language. For some children, verbal speech is sufficient for them to understand what we're expecting of them. And so the directions, some of the requests that we probably are going to be making when we're teaching some social skills are, give that to your friend if we're trying to teach turn taking or sharing, or it's your turn, or say hello to your friend if we're trying to teach an initiation of a social interaction. If we're trying to teach requesting, or if we're trying to teach choice making or other communication skills, then the request might be, what do you want? Or the request might be, what is your choice? Which one do you want? Or it might be, something like, are you finished with this? If the child is demonstrating some kind of a protest response. So we want to write down what we're trying to say to the child, and also how we're going to relay that information to them. And then, as I've harped on several times, the most important part of this piece is listing on there what the wait time is going to be for the child. And generally, when we're working on intervention plans as a group, this is where the largest discussion comes from, because we really want to, as I've said before, we don't want to wait so long that the child gets frustrated, but we don't want to jump in too quickly so that the child doesn't have time to process the information about what we're expecting of them. Let me say that again. We don't want to wait so long so that the child is frustrated. But at the same time, we don't want to jump in too quickly and help them when the child may not have had time to process what the expectation is. So that's just a huge part of what we're going to do. And I'm going to share some data that we have in a bit about the importance of wait time. So that's the antecedent. Yes.
Carrie, I'm just going to jump in. Can we pause for a quick interpreter switch?
Of course.
Thanks. Okay, I think we're all set.
All right. So let me pause here for just 30 seconds and see if there are any questions about that before section, how the adult is setting the occasion. Maybe it's a question that you had in trying to develop your intervention plan. Perhaps it's a question about something that's unclear to you. But let me just pause here for just a few seconds and see if any of you have questions about this element.
This is Carrie again. And as a reminder, you can just put any questions that you might have in the chat box. Dr. Grisham, I don't see any questions yet, okay, but I will certainly let you know if any pop up.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
All right, so I'll move on then to the second element of the intervention plan, and that's the behavior. So we were doing this, we were developing an intervention plan just before Christmas with a family that Donna Carpenter and I work with, and it really kind of occurred to us all at the same time that the first element is like something that the adult does, okay? So that's the adult setting the occasion. The middle element is what the child does. So the child is either going to make a request, take a turn, make a choice, initiate a social interaction, share a material. They're going to do one of those things, or they're not. And so we have to know how to respond based on how the child behaves. And so, and when I use the word behavior, I'm not talking about like challenging behavior. I'm talking about a skill, a measurable and observable skill that we are trying to change, that we're trying to improve for the child. I really don't deal in, you know, trying to design interventions for challenging behavior, because I believe all challenging behavior, has some kind of a purpose or a function. And so those functions usually are oftentimes around communication and social interaction. And so when I'm talking about behavior here, I'm talking about that skill that we're trying to improve. In the left-hand column then are the things that we consider when we're writing about that correct response. How independent do we want the child to be? Does the child have to do it without any kind of sort of prompting from an adult? Or is it okay if they have some kind of partial prompting from an adult? Is an approximation okay? We talked about this with sign language, that, if a child just brings their hands together to midline, does that count as a sign for more? Or does the child have to do the sign exactly as the sign is supposed to be done? Is it okay for the child to use alternative behaviors? Is it okay for the child to use a sign, or for the child to use a vocalization, or for the child to touch a picture? Is it okay for either of those to count as a correct response? And then the latency, what that refers to is if I say that the child is going to respond, that the processing time, so I say, what do you want? I wait 5 seconds. If the child doesn't respond within 5 seconds, then there's a latency issue. So as I'm writing about what the correct response is, then I want to say that the child will do that within 5 seconds. So within the period of time that I have listed as the wait time. I'm going to show you an example in a minute, so hopefully it'll make more sense if it's not now. An incorrect response is when the child just does nothing. So the 5 seconds go by and nothing happens. If the child does the incorrect response, and so in the intervention plan that we're going to see, the child is supposed to bring his hands to midline and touch them together one time, not this, which is a behavior that he did frequently. And so if he does this, then that would be an incorrect response, because it's not what the defined correct response is. And then the latency, which means that the child did not respond within the correct period of time. So I'll show you an example of that in just a second. And then the third piece, so this column, the antecedent column, the before column is what the adult does to set the occasion. The middle column is what the child does. And then the third column is what the adult does. So adult, child, adult. That's another way to think about these different elements. So if the child does what he or she is supposed to do, then the teacher or the peer acknowledge or comment on the child demonstrating the correct response. And this can come in the form of specific verbal praise. I'm sure if you all have been involved with Carrie's project, that you all know that specific verbal praise is much more effective than general praise. So just saying, good job, versus you asked for help, or you took a turn, or you made a choice, or you told me that you wanted grapes for snack, whatever the case may be. So giving that specific praise is important. Also, in addition to or by itself, the environment can be set up so that the child gains access to what the material is. And so, if the child, I'll give you an example. So we were working at the children's home where I work. We were setting up the environment. We had a little girl who was really struggling to make her request known, and she was so cute. that everybody just gave her whatever they knew she wanted. All she had to do was go, and they would give it to her. And she was nonverbal. And so, so we put things on a shelf that were a little bit too high for her. And when she wanted that and she went over to that, what we were trying to get her to do was to say, help. And so she went over and she started doing that. Then the teacher would say, what do you want? And then when the child said help or modeled help, then the child got the material. In this case, it was, I remember a videotape of her and she's wanting plasticina, or she's wanting Play-Doh. And so we get the Play-Doh down and we give it to her. And so she gets what she wants. And so that's the environment being set up in a way so that the reinforcement is, or the consequence is, that she's getting what she requested. She's using the correct response to get what she wants. And in some cases, children are intrinsically reinforced for performing the skill where they just like it, and that's why. You're going to remember that I said that the most important part of the intervention plan is really what we do if the child does not respond. And so this is where you really have to take into account those evidence-based practices that I talked to you all about in sessions 1 and 2. And so if I'm, for example, implementing a system of least prompts intervention, then what I'm going to do is that if the child doesn't perform the skill independently, then I'm going to give them just a little bit more support. Perhaps it's a gesture, or perhaps it's a verbal model, or perhaps it's a visual model. So I'm going to give them a little bit of support. I'm going to then wait again to see if the child performs the skill correctly. And if they don't, then I'm going to give them a more intrusive or more of a prompt or more support. And so let's say, for example, that I'm trying to get a child, in the case of Peter, which we've seen his video, so this might resonate with you. So with Peter, his mom asks him what does he want, and she waits. If he doesn't do it, then she gives the model. She waits again, and if he still doesn't do it, then she physically prompts him to form that sign. And so she's giving a little bit of support, and then she's giving more support. If I'm implementing the man model intervention, then I would give a model, I would wait, I would give the model again, and then after 2 models, if you recall, then I give the child what it is that they want. If I'm implementing a constant time delay intervention, then what I would do is I would wait the 4 or 5 seconds. If the child doesn't do it, I would give the prompt, and then I give the prompt only 1 time, and then I give the child what they want if they still don't respond. So the way that I design this part of the intervention is really dependent on the type of evidence-based practice that I'm using. And if you need more examples of that, I can show them to you. But so this is a really important piece. What we're trying to do with an ARC or with an embedded learning opportunity is that we're trying to complete this whole teaching loop. And so I give the antecedent, I set up the situation, wait for the child to respond. If the child doesn't respond, then I go ahead and I give the child some additional support. What I don't want to do is I don't want to give the child an opportunity to respond, then not wait long enough, and then go back to giving the child an opportunity to respond. I can't, I'm sorry if I'm repeating my stories, but I worked on a big grant with children who have autism. And one of the things that we were doing is looking at teachers' adherence to, they called them teaching plans on this particular grant, but they were essentially intervention plans. And so we had to watch hours upon hours of teachers implementing interventions. And one of the things that I started to notice is that teachers were getting in this loop where instead of going ahead and giving the child an opportunity to respond, and more importantly, scaffolding and giving them that extra support, they would go back to the antecedent again. And so the one that really drove me crazy was where a teacher was, they were doing an art activity and a teacher was giving 2 or 3 different choices of what color the child wanted to use to paint with. And the teacher said, "Which one do you want?" And instead of waiting for the child to respond, she said, "Do you want this one or this one?" Instead of waiting again for the child to respond, "Do you want red or do you want blue or do you want green?" Instead of what, and so, and each time she did it, her voice kept getting louder. She kept getting more emphatic about it. But asking those questions louder, asking them faster, asking them more frequently, asking them a different way is not teaching the child. It's not teaching the child. The child has to have the opportunity to practice the correct response with our support before they're going to learn it. And so I hope if you don't get anything else out of this, that you really monitor yourself or monitor those that you all are observing. It just drives me crazy when I go in, and it's a common error, and we all do it, you know, where people are not giving children long enough times, whether it's a child with typical development or a child with complex needs, they're not giving them a long enough time to process. And so they think that the way that they can get them to respond is just to ask the question more frequently or louder or whatever, and the child will do it. So let me pause here again and just see if there are any questions at all about, again, the intervention plans that you all hopefully developed, or any questions about any specific element of the intervention plan. And while I'm waiting and Carrie is monitoring that, I'm going to pull up an example that we're going to look at. Carrie, are there any questions anyone has?
I don't see any in the chat box yet.
All right. So this is an intervention plan that you all should have a copy of this in your handouts. And I'll just walk you through this a little bit. This is a little boy that Donna Carpenter from the Kentucky Deafblind Project and I worked with a couple of years ago, and still working with him. And you'll see all the elements here. So again, with him, indicating more by using approximation of the sign for more. And we're going to do this 2 times per week with all 3 activities. He was in a preschool program. It was an inclusive program, but primarily for children with visual impairments. So here we have that when we were going to do it. So we looked at activities that we knew he really enjoyed. So during music, he also liked this exerciser that kind of spun him around a little bit. And then there was a pom-pom switch toy that he really did like. We were going to do it in the classroom. So for the first activity would be in the classroom. And actually, the music activity also occurred some in this kids' town, which was, this is one of the most fabulous buildings. This was a nonprofit program, and so they had gotten businesses to donate these replicas of like the bank. There was a bank there, you know, that children could play in, like a play area. So it was a whole town of these little businesses, if you will. There was the Kentucky Fried Chicken, as you all can imagine. There was one of those. And so anyway, so they called it Kids Town. And so sometimes she would take him in there for the music time, because as you'll see, all of the friends were excited about the kind of music that this particular child liked. And also in the classroom. The materials, this child is from Latino heritage, so he Um, Not necessarily because of that, but perhaps because that's what they listen to at home. He really likes salsa music, the exerciser, a propeller toy on the playground, and then the pom-pom switch. And then you'll see the detail that we get into for how to set the occasion. So we set his name by touching his shoulder, and then also letting him touch the object that he's going to use or listen to. And though, and then we also listed on here how we would know that we had his attention. So if he tenses or gets excited or raises his head or vocalizes, then we know that he is understanding what activity is about to occur. This is really, really important with children who, again, don't have typical response modes. And we talk about it a lot in the field of deaf blindness, that, if children can't, say, oh, good, that's exciting, I love that activity, then we have to look at their nonverbal communication as a strategy for how, or as a way of knowing that they understand what's about to happen. We also, because we were using that milieu teaching strategy, then we also looked in here about the environmental arrangement. And so the environmental arrangement was to turn off the music and start it again, or move away from him, or remove the toy from him, so that it created an opportunity for him to do that. So going back to session 1 of our training together, I talked about 3 different types of environmental arrangement strategies with milieu teaching. And one of those was access. And so that's what we were doing. We were limiting his access to whatever it was he wanted, so that he had an opportunity, or an opportunity was created for him to respond. So we want to tell him it's my turn when they stop the activity. And then after the teacher took her turn, then we want to use hand under hand to model more and say, you want more. And then our hope was that he would then say more. So we were going to wait 8 seconds for him to respond. This is a child that not only has sensory impairments, but also has some physical disabilities as well. So that's how it was set up.
Dr. Grisham, this is Carrie. I'm just going to do a quick pause for an interpreter switch.
All right, so now, so the before column is what we do. The middle column is what the child does. So the correct response is the child has to bring his hands to midline. They have to be touching in a fist, so like this, or open hands only one time. So remember, this is the child that did this. So we were trying to get some kind of approximation. Or he could be approaching midline. So if his hands were like up like this, then that was okay too. If he did the correct response, so we're going across this way, then what we do as adults is that we give him access to the toy and also specific verbal praise. Uh-oh, sorry about that. If he doesn't do it, then there's no response after 10 seconds. That should actually match. So that should actually be 8 seconds. If he uses any other motion with his hands or arms, so if he slaps them, or if he's hitting the table, or he's doing anything other than bringing them together one time like this, then we're going to provide the hand under hand model again. We're going to wait 8 seconds again. And then if he still doesn't do it, then we're going to give him access to the activity. And so this is, again, this is the way that this particular intervention or evidence-based practice is implemented. And so that's what we would do if the child does it incorrectly. So are there any questions about that particular intervention plan, or anything? I know that was a long time to review, but I felt like that we didn't really get a chance last time to look at an example, and we kind of rushed through the implementation. Typically, when I do workshops on intervention planning. I do it across an entire day. So I wanted to do a little bit of review there. So, all right. So what we're going to talk about next, if there are no questions, is that we're going to talk about implementation and how do you measure the success of an intervention. So the question is, what has to happen in order that embedded learning opportunities are effective? And this has been one of the main areas of research that I've been doing for 25 years, really, is to try to figure out what do we have to do to support teachers to implement embedded learning opportunities so that children will learn. And so the two things that I think need to be in place are, first of all, careful planning. I did a study many years ago now where we trained teachers on how to select activities in which to embed IEP learning goals and activities. And I think I showed you all a video of that in one of our sessions. But it wasn't until we taught the teachers to be very intentional about their planning that we actually saw child change. It wasn't until the teachers actually developed an intervention plan, like I've been teaching you all, that we actually started to see children to learn new skills. And I think that's because um, it did ensure that intentionality. I think that teachers like to think that they're being intentional in their teaching, but until we all get on the same page, and again, especially so important for this group of children, that we can actually implement something. And people are typically rather surprised at how quickly some of the children they work with will learn new skills when we implement with fidelity and when we implement using a plan. So developing a plan is important. And the second is implementation fidelity. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the time that we have remaining. So this is what plagued my childhood. This lady in the background here was my maternal grandmother, and her name was Willie Hankins. But for whatever reason, my grandfather taught us to call her Mother Bill, which he would call her Bill sometime, and she didn't really like it, but she found it endearing that my sister and I called her Mother Bill. But what she told us all the time about everything we were doing, whether it was teaching me to crochet, which she never did successfully do, or to cook or clean or whatever it was, is that she would say anything worth doing is worth doing the right way. And those words have haunted me and probably made me more into a perfectionist than I prefer to be. But these words come to my mind when I think about implementing something, implementing instruction for children. And the truth is that there is substantial research that suggests that unless we implement interventions in our curriculum and we implement it correctly, that children are not going to learn. And so a bit of an overview about implementation fidelity. The focus of examination with implementation fidelity has been twofold. One has been on instructional strategies, which is what we're going to focus on today. And the other has been on curricular content that's been delivered. And so there are a lot of different curriculum models that are out there in early childhood now, where people, there are certain steps for implementing it. The pyramid model is an example of that. I mean, I don't know that they would like for us to call it a curricular model, but they do have now, steps for, accurately implementing the pyramid model. And so, because they've learned, that if you implement it with fidelity, then you're going to see better outcomes than if you don't. And some of the aspects of and implementation fidelity that have been looked at is our structural implementation, which focuses on the amount of instruction that a child gets or the number of lessons provided. And so if I have a child who has complex needs, then and I'm implementing the intervention once a week, it's possible the child's not going to learn. And I may be doing everything perfectly, but if I'm not doing it frequently enough for the child to learn, then the child is not going to learn. So structural implementation is important. Process implementation focuses on the delivery of that, the key features of that curriculum or the quality of the delivery. So if there are certain ways that I'm supposed to deliver certain lessons, then that would be the process implementation for that curriculum. And then if I'm supposed to be implementing an evidence-based practice like system of least prompts or constant time delay or milieu teaching, then I want to look at the quality of that delivery. Am I following the steps of how that evidence-based practice is supposed to be implemented? There also, there is lots of research, as I've already alluded to, that show the impact of implementation fidelity on child outcomes. And so oftentimes in the research that we do in early childhood special ed, we're not just looking at whether or not a child learns a new skill, but we're also looking at the implementation of the person who implemented the intervention. And so much of the research right now in early childhood education, especially ed and early childhood ed, are around coaching parents or coaching teachers to implement an evidence-based practice. And so sometimes the key dependent variable that we're looking at is the degree with which the implementer implements the intervention with fidelity. And so, and then the child outcomes become a secondary dependent variable. So there are some things that we know are going to implement the impact of that intervention. First of all, they're the curriculum instruction. And so, you know, one of the things in early childhood education that makes us so unique and different from other K-12 K-12 services, I guess, is that we don't, the people that work in early childhood have a variety of different educational backgrounds. And so there are people that work in childcare, for example, who are fully credentialed with a child development associate degree. There are also people that work in early childhood and publicly funded pre-K programs who have a master's degree in early childhood. And so there's great variability in the amount of education that people who work in early childhood have. And so I guess I suppose that's a teacher variable, but a person's capacity sometimes to implement curriculum or instruction is sometimes dependent on their education level. Now, caveat to that, that is not always true. I have worked in childcare. I have worked with teachers who have child development associate degrees who adhere to interventions as well, if not better sometimes, than teachers who have master's degree. But sometimes people who have more advanced degrees come into the work setting with some foundational knowledge that may not be present for others. And so those teacher variables have to be considered when we're looking at implementation. And then there are some things beyond the teacher. Sometimes it's administrative considerations or programmatic considerations that occur that prevent the teacher from implementing with fidelity. I have seen policies take place in school districts that sometimes prevent teachers from implementing all types of instruction the way that they're supposed to. A common one that I talk about a lot is calendar time, which is something that has bit little, no evidence based in early childhood. Yet it's something that is very frequently seen in early childhood settings, beginning as young as 1 year olds. I've seen people sit down with 1 year olds and try to do calendar time, when in fact we know developmentally children don't understand time until they're around 7 years old. But yet in some schools, whether it's the culture of the school or whether or not it's a policy with the administration, calendar time is just something that's part of what we do. And so those are beyond the teacher's ability to be able to control what's going on in the classroom. So let's look at the different ways that we can measure implementation fidelity. Oh, let me give you an example. So this was one of my students, and she did her master's thesis looking at implementation fidelity of teaching assistants. And so again, these are not folks that have, actually don't have a master's degree in early childhood special ed, or in our case, in Kentucky, in interdisciplinary early childhood education. But she wanted to see if the teaching assistants in her classroom were able to implement system of least prompts and constant time delay, which are both strategies that I've tried to teach you all in this series. So she paired each of two of the teachers with preschoolers. One of them had Down syndrome, and the other one, I can't remember now because I can't see it, but they were both children with disabilities. In the first, the target skills for both children were making choices and following one-step directions. So she was teaching them how to follow one-step directions using system of least prompts, and she was teaching them to make choices with constant time delay. And what she found is that with a very simple, she did a very short, brief training with the teachers, and she was able to teach them and provide them coaching after each session, that the teachers were able to implement both of those procedures with their target child with 100% accuracy after they had training and by receiving weekly coaching sessions. And she also found that both of the children made progress on their target skills. So that relationship again between implementation fidelity and making progress. Dr. Crawford, as she is now for her dissertation, replicated this study in a Head Start program where she taught Head Start teachers to implement some of these same interventions. And it was surprising to me in watching her implement that. It was so surprising to me to see how quickly the teachers were able to catch on, because the training that she actually did with the teachers was very brief. It was about 15 to 30 minutes long at the most. And then the coaching that she did with the teachers lasted anywhere from 3 to 10 minutes. And so I think what happens partially is that teachers start to see that children are making progress, and they become motivated then to implement more frequently and to implement with fidelity. So now we'll talk about the strategies for measuring fidelity. The first is procedural fidelity. The second is something I call common elements, and the third is teacher report. So if we're doing procedural reliability, and this is something that we use a lot in our research, then we're looking at the number of planned teacher behaviors. So it's essentially the number of steps that the teacher is supposed to implement. And so for very easy math here. So if there are 10 steps to the intervention, then we subtract that from the number of actual steps that the teacher implemented. So if the teacher implemented 8, then we divide that by the number of planned teacher behaviors, which was 10, which would give us a procedural reliability score of 80%. And this occurs when an outside observer is actually watching the teacher and then calculating that procedural reliability score. And so, for example, I took the steps of the system of least prompts. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps. And so what we would do is that we would look at and see if the child gives a task request, if they wait the predetermined number of seconds, if they don't do it, if the child gives a prompt, if they wait again, does the teacher wait a second time for the child to respond? Do they give a second prompt if it's needed? And do they give a consequence at all levels? And then do they use that for each sequence if it's a chain task? So I would just simply go through. This would be like a checklist. So these are not difficult data sheets, if you will. For those of you who are administrators out there, if you want to see if teachers are implementing the steps of any of the evidence-based practices that we've talked about correctly, then you can go back to those PowerPoints that I've developed where I've got listed the steps of the intervention and then develop an intervention, a data sheet very quickly so that you can measure the degree with which they are following the procedures, which is what we would call procedural reliability. The second way that we can measure, so I mentioned the study that I did a few years ago. It was a National Institute of Health, NIH study, where we were looking at teaching practices for children with autism. And one of the things that we started thinking about is that there are some common elements across all of these different interventions. And so we developed this data sheet, which is included in your PowerPoint, that can really be used with any type of intervention that you develop, whether it's constant time delay, system of least prompts, whatever it is, you could use this particular data sheet. Because what you're going to see here, if you look closely, is that here I've got over here, again, this is what the adult does. All right, so the child has to engage the child in activity with materials, establish that joint attention, make the request, and wait for the child to respond. All right, so these are essentially the elements of the intervention plan that the teacher is supposed to do to set the occasion for the child to respond. Then, based on how the child responds, and I can check that off there, then the teacher will do either this set of practices or this set of practices here. So if the child responds correctly, then does the teacher do one of those things? Do they give specific praise? Do they allow the environment to provide feedback? But do they do something to give positive reinforcement for the child to do it? If the child does not do it, then does the teacher do engaging these practices so that the child can get practice and can get practice with the correct response? And so we just published a paper about these common elements. If there are any research nerds out there that want to know about that, I'll be happy to share it with you. But this could actually be used for any type of intervention that a teacher is trying to implement. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you all about that study is that, so we looked at adherence, or we looked at a teacher's implementation fidelity, and then we also looked at IEP goals in 3 areas for the children that were in this study. And that one was in communication, one was in social, and then one was what we called labeled work skills. And so we were really interested to see which of these practices that are kind of part of these common elements really related most to the child outcomes. And if I was sitting in front of you, I would have you guess. But the truth is that the variable that was most closely aligned with or was most related to child outcomes was this one down here, wait time. So it, for me, validated something that I've been saying for a long period of time, which is that that we have to give children, we have to really focus on, and we really have to think about, what is that amount of time a child needs to process information. And so there were other variables. Engaging a child in a motivational activity was also very closely related to the children's outcomes, meaning that the children whose teachers used wait time, their IEP goals, they scored higher on their IEP goals than teachers who didn't wait. That teachers who engage children in motivating activities, that those children whose teachers did that, they had better IEP outcomes than children whose teachers did not engage them in motivating activities. And so real lessons learned there for the importance of these specific types of behaviors that that adults need to engage in order for children to learn. And so what I want to do now is I'm going to shift to, I would like for you all, let me back up. I would like for you all to pull out that intervention plan for the little boy that I showed you earlier in this session. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you all to look at that intervention plan while you watch a videotape of the teacher implementing it. And then I'm going to ask you all to write in the chat box one of the behaviors that you saw the teacher do correctly, and one of the behaviors that you saw the teacher do incorrectly. So I hope that that makes sense. So I'm going to shift now, stop sharing, and I'm going to share with you the videotape.
Dr. Grisham, I'm just going to interrupt really fast. This is Carrie. While we're setting up for that, can we take a pause for an interpreter switch? And that'll give folks some time to make sure they've pulled up that material that was sent to them.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. So again, we're going to watch this for 3 or 4 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to look at the intervention plan and then identify one teacher behavior that was done correctly and any teacher behaviors that were not done correctly.
Hey Camilla, are you ready to listen to some music? Do you want to listen to some salsa music? Yeah? Okay, here we go. It's your turn. Can you come over here and listen to the music? We're not watching a video, we're just listening. Hey friends, I need you all to go over to the kitchen and play. Science is closed right now. Oh, I need you to go to the kitchen.
Good.
Take that back to the kitchen, please. Take that back to the kitchen, please.
I'll be right here. We'll be practicing on my camera. And he said, and this one's Katie, this one's Connor. Is that go? Connor, get you one. Come over here. Okay, you get that.
Okay, it's my turn.
Connor, don't set that on top there. It'll fall and break. That is for mixing.
Okay, to the music. It's my turn.
Okay.
You want more music? More music. Do you like this song? Okay, it's my turn.
to him. Look at me. I know. Do not just get away from me. Sit down right here and play. Look, I want y'all to pick him up.
You want more music? Good job. You asked for more music. Okay, it's my turn.
No, sir. Go get something cleaned up. You know better.
You want more music? Good job. I like how you asked for more music. It's my turn. You want more music? You can have more music. Good job. Thank you for asking. Okay, it's my turn. You want more music? You would like more music?
I'm gonna make you some pizza to go with it.
All right, I think that gives you a good idea of the kinds of behaviors that we're looking at. So I'm going to give you all about 2 minutes to please put your responses in the chat box of things that you saw that she did correctly and things that she wasn't doing. And I will pull up the intervention plan again while we're looking at that.
Dr. Grisham, this is Carrie. Would you like me to read the responses or can you see them?
It would be great if you could read those for me, and I can that'll give me an opportunity to look at the intervention. So, yeah, if we've got some responses, let's go start looking at them. We'll have discussion.
Sure. So Stacy shared that the teacher acknowledged the student's excitement to the music.
Yes, and so one of the things that it says in the intervention plan is that that you'll know that the child you have the child's attention when he tenses, gets excited, raises his head, or vocalizes. And so I know he raised his head. I know that he looked excited, and she maintained his attention throughout the entire session. So that was good observation. Another?
Similarly, Patricia shared that she kept asking the student if he wanted more music. When he responded, she replied by dancing as to reinforce the student's choice.
Mm-hmm.
Donna shared that she acknowledged his sign for more.
So if we look on the intervention plan, it says that if he brings his hand to midline, that she's to give him access to it and tell him that you want, in this case, it would be that you want more music. And so she did do that, yes.
Marcy highlighted that the first time she repeated her question before providing adequate wait time, she's responding and not giving him the music when she sees his response. So she said, and other people shared, that there was not enough wait time.
Yes, absolutely. And so, yeah, that's always the, the big issue is that, for us who have all of our, our sensory processing systems are all on fire. We can hear things and see things. 8 seconds is a very long time. It seems like a very long time to wait, and it takes, it takes a lot of practice to not interrupt and do that. So, good observation. Others?
Lots of folks are talking about the verbal praise she provided. Also, Kristen talked about the hand under hand model being used.
Yes, which you see that's part of the intervention plan here. And of course, is a recommended practice for children who are deafblind. Can't say that often enough.
She responded to multiple taps of his hand and reinforced him.
Yes. Yeah, and so that's where this becomes so important, because there were many times where it was clear that he was just bringing his hands together one time and she immediately gave him the music. But there were a couple of times when he brought his hands together. There were times where he really looked like he was dancing the salsa to me. But there were also times when he was just kind of, his hands were, kind of just, flapping, if you will. And she did go on and give him the music in those situations. And so that can be very very confusing for a child if they get reinforced for behaviors that are not what the expected response is. And so more often than not, it seemed to me that she did respond to the correct response, but there were a couple of times when she didn't.
And I think Marcy just made a note in the chat, which I appreciate. It looks like a lot of folks are just writing in the chat to all of the panelists. So that means the attendees can't see what you're writing. So if you go to where it says 2 at the bottom of the chat box, and in blue, you'll see it might say all panelists. But if you click that little down arrow, you can change it so that it says all panelists and attendees, so that everyone can see all the awesome stuff you're saying. So thanks, Marcy, for pointing that out. Jaquita did say that in the beginning, she said, my turn, and then she responded to his excitement.
Yeah, so that's off the way that it was supposed to be set up. This was a little bit further along in our work on this particular intervention, and so he was responding independently some of the time without her having to do the hand under hand. Because he was immediately using the correct response. It's a good video too, because it shows the reality of trying to implement embedded learning opportunities into an inclusive preschool classroom. When you've got other children in that classroom that are, maybe interested in what the child is interested in. And they're also, maybe it's distracting other children from doing what they want to do. And so how to finesse that, I think, is something that takes a lot of practice, to figure out how to, find the right moment so that we don't have to say to everybody else, well, you can't play in the science area right now, which, there were lots of things going on. That's not necessarily a criticism, but I just think that it is difficult a lot of times when you've got other children there, but that's the reality. And, I'm not a huge fan of separating children out to try to do these tier 3 interventions. It's difficult, but it's possible. And in all of the research that I've done in these 25 years, they've always been in classroom where there have been other children that have been around. because some see them as a distraction. Some see them as, actually preventing children from making progress. But I believe that it's the reality in which children live. And so they need to be able to process information under those circumstances. That's my personal bias. Not that we don't occasionally do some, separate kind of instruction, but the majority of time needs to be in the locations in which other children spend time and where they're going to spend time. So, any other comments about this, Carrie?
Marcy just said it's the reality of the teachers too. Busy classrooms, lots of young active kids.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And it's interesting to me too, what happens sometimes in these situations is that those children that we think are just wandering around and looking around, they are watching. They are watching the teacher and how they're interacting with other children. And it's not uncommon in these programs to then see a child come in, and a child who's typically developing then take over and do some semblance of the intervention with the child, without any prompting at all. And that's a really beautiful sight to see, I think. We talk a lot about peer tutoring and peer support and all of that for children that are a little bit older, but I've seen children that are very young, and model appropriate behavior for, and actually do elements of some interventions with children that have disabilities. And so that's the way I think we want the world to work, right? Anything else?
Just people echoing what you're saying, Dr. Grisham, that it's important for the teacher to model the appropriate behavior. But everyone kind of had the same themes, with wait time being the need for improvement.
Right. All right, I have a couple of more slides to share, and we're approaching that time where our time together is just about over. But okay. All right, so if any of you all want this particular data sheet, if you'd like to have it as a PDF, I can send this to Carrie, and she can get this to you all. Again, that's just something that we used on that particular grant. So 3 different ways that we can measure implementation fidelity. The first being the procedural reliability, where we actually look at the steps of a particular intervention. The second way is to look at it through this kind of common elements lens. And then the third way we can do it is that we can ask teachers to self-evaluate. And I know that people, they'll always say, well, they're not going to tell the truth, whatever. But it's a very common way that we do things often in research, is to have teachers implement. And so I put this together actually for a workshop similar to what I've done with you all, although they were full day sessions and they were face to face. But this is a self-report that I think that that you could use, especially for those of you who are in administrative positions, to try to get a feel for whether or not teachers believe that they're implementing with fidelity. And so it's just a rubric that I designed where we're asking, how well did you do? So this is asking the question, do you think that you implemented the steps of the intervention correctly? And so we go from, I don't get it at all. I didn't start this because I'm confused, overwhelmed, and frustrated, thinking that I'm getting there. I wrote the intervention plan and I've started the implementation, but there's still some steps on which I continue to struggle. Or I've got it. I wrote the intervention plan, I've implemented it, and I believe that I am following all steps of the plan. So I'd really like to get a little bit of feedback from you all. We're not going to share this out loud, but I'm just interested in, since we did start the intervention, talk about the intervention plan process in our last session, then I'd like to know how well you all are doing or what else you still need. And I would think this might be helpful to Robert and Donna and Carrie as they try to support you all moving forward with this information. So if you'll just write in the chat box if you're willing, I don't get it, I'm getting there, or I've got it.
And Dr. Grisham, while folks are doing that, we'll take a minute for our last interpreter switch.
All right.
Thank you. So far, most folks are saying getting there.
Wonderful. That's great news. That is great news. And so I hope that there'll be some mechanism, Carrie, that you all can reach out to these folks and see how you can help them to get to the point where they wrote it. The last slide here is how well did it work? So we're looking here at whether or not children made progress or not. The rubric is that improvement is needed. There's no progress. Didn't start the intervention. Getting there, which would mean that the child made minimal progress. They are still making a lot of errors and still waiting for prompt, or they got it. The child has reached criteria across materials and activities and people, and you're ready to write another intervention plan. And so I won't ask you to report on this at this point, but again, for those of you who are working with teachers, this is a good way to judge not only the implementation, the degree with which the teachers are implementing the intervention correctly, but also whether or not the child is making progress or not. And so it's a very simple rubric that you can use. So my time with you all is really almost over. And so I know Carrie has a few parting words, but we're getting up to the top of the hour. So I will take just a couple of minutes to answer any questions that you have. I think that I've given you all my email address, and so I'm available for questions if you have those past the time of this workshop. I appreciate what you do. I appreciate what you're trying to do on these unusual times. And I hope that this has provided you with some new strategies that you can think about in your classroom or in supporting teachers in this classroom. So I'll stop there, Carrie, and let you take over.
Thanks, Dr. Grisham. I will go ahead and share my slides, but I will let you know, Dr. Grisham, folks definitely would like a copy of that data sheet that you shared. We had a lot of comments about that. So, bear with me. All right, so you'll see on the screen just a little bit of information about how you can learn more about South Carolina Partnerships for Inclusion. I'll talk about that in a second, but first I would be remiss if I didn't thank everyone who participated today and throughout this series. I echo Dr. Grisham, we really appreciate all that you do, and we are glad that you took some time to tune in for some professional development to support you and to support the kids and families that you serve. Thank you, Dr. Grisham, for hosting this series for us and sharing your knowledge and expertise. And thank you to our friends at the South Carolina and Kentucky Deafblind Projects for collaborating with us. We also really, really appreciate our interpreters to make this session more accessible. I'm about to drop a link in the chat box so that you all can provide some feedback on today's session. We really appreciate your input, and also let us know what you'd like to see next. Let us know how we can continue to support you with implementation and Fidelity. So give me a second so I can make sure I put that in there. Okay, it's in there, but I'll also make sure to email that out to you in case you don't capture it right now. And as a reminder, you'll receive an email next week with the recording from today, and then all 3 sessions in this series will be made available on our YouTube in the coming weeks. So that's something that you'll be able to share with staff that you support, colleagues, friends, families, etc. Again, if you'd like more information about SCIPI or South Carolina Partnerships for Inclusion, you can check out the website, www.scpartnershipsforinclusion.org. You can use the Contact Us button at the top to reach out, let us know what questions you have or how we can support you. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter, which comes out monthly, so you can get more information about professional training opportunities and other resources that we are sharing. As always, you can also email us at scpi@mailbox.sc.edu. I think that's all that I have. Again, thank you everyone, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Trying to see if there were any questions. I know we still have a few minutes left, so I'm looking at my other screen. I'm just seeing a lot of thank yous, Dr. Grisham.
You are welcome. It was my pleasure. This is the topic I'm most passionate about, is, how to train teachers to be good teachers. And so I'm glad it was helpful to some of you.
So someone did have a question about how you get certificates for participating. We're not sending out general participation certificates. If you wanted CEUs, continuing education credits, that's how you'll get a certificate. Or if you would like childcare training credits through SE Endeavors. And I had sent out a Google form to capture that information last month. If for some reason you didn't get a chance to fill that form out, you can just go ahead and email us at the email address on your screen and let me know, and we can make sure that we can get you squared up with that information. And again, we unfortunately can't offer training credits and CEUs to folks that are watching the recording. We have a requirement that it needs to be live. Any other questions? Well, we appreciate you all. Please don't forget to complete the evaluation. Give us your feedback. What do you want to see next? How can SCIPI support you? How can our partners support you? What innovative things would you like to see from us? All right.
Bye.
I see just a lot of thank yous. So if I don't have any questions, we can give you back 2 minutes of your time. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.